Hey everyone, welcome back to our weekly live. Today we are going to talk about a fascinating subject, which is the cell, the basic unit of life, and how it relates to weight loss. First, a couple of technical details. Number one, unfortunately, as you can see, I am forced to deprive you of my appearance. This is again a technical thing. I have terrible internet problems. When I do lives, it tends to not work and it fades out. It goes to black. Very, very frustrating. So, what I've done to compensate is, first of all, this is not live per se. I am recording. That doesn't mean you cannot drop a like or share or put an emoji up or whatever, but just be aware this is recorded, so I will not get back to you right away. I can't answer anything directly. Um, and the other thing is that I've turned the camera off, and instead, what you're seeing is a logo. Now, it just so happens that it is my logo, but it also happens that it is a pulsating logo. So it does give you a sense of my energy and the appearance of motion and of actual speech coming through the logo. All right. Of course, what matters the most is the information that I'm imparting. And as always, I try to break down complex topics to be relatively intelligible with the purpose of using the information so it's not overwhelming and everybody can get better outcomes. That's the whole idea. I like to communicate to my client base and beyond, and this is what we're doing. So let's get into it, right? I promised that we would be taking a journey into the cell, and that is precisely what we're going to be doing. So here's the big picture. Think of your cells like a bustling city. And just as a city needs electricity, clean water, good roads, communication systems, waste removal, your cells need the same things. And it's also the case that all of these various functions are interconnected. So if one thing's not working, then multiple things will not be working. And the cells are that basic unit of life. So the cells come together to form organs. The organs come together to form systems. Those systems work together to, form our bodies. And this is what keeps us going. So if we are to be healthy, if we want to lose weight and do it correctly, it's going to involve addressing the cell, addressing these little cities that you actually have 200 trillion of them or something like that in your body. Okay. So when everything is working, we're fortunate enough to live in the New York area. And New York is a functioning city, even though sometimes it feels like it's not. It's a madhouse. But when everything is working, life flows pretty smoothly. And I'm always amazed at how a million people can commute to Manhattan every day and how well Manhattan functions in spite of its challenges. Now, everything can break down if a single thing breaks down, like electricity. Electricity is what we have to think of as energy. In our metaphor that we're using here. So if the electricity breaks down in New York, the traffic lights aren't going to work. Water pumps will fail. Communication grids will go down. And this is exactly what happens in your cells, especially in regards to weight loss. Most of us, unfortunately, are trying to lose weight while our cellular city is in chaos. Right? So it's like when Manhattan is having blackouts or various threats, it's not functioning as well. And it's really the same idea. So let's discuss now the 7 critical systems that determine whether your cells can actually burn fat or if they're just stuck in survival mode. Because that tends to be how it works. Those things work in opposition, right? Good function will equal efficient fat burning. Bad function is your body going into survival mode. and that will equal fat storage. Okay. So the first thing we're going to discuss, like I said, is energy, because energy is so necessary for every other function. And in the body and in the cells, we call that ATP, and it's your cellular power grid. And think of it like electricity, like we were saying, and every single thing your cells do requires energy. That's also true on a macro basis. Everything that you do requires energy. And at the cellular level, again, ATP is that energy currency that we need to exchange. Now, just one little example is this. You have something that's part of your cell that's called the sodium potassium pump. Everyone's heard of sodium, everyone's heard of potassium. Some of us have heard that we need a balance between them. But it's because sodium will take water and nutrients out of the cell, and potassium will put them into the cell. And so there has to be a balance. Everything works on a balance. And this pump is what keeps your cells properly hydrated and functioning. So the sodium potassium pump alone, which is just one little mechanism in the cell, albeit an important one, uses up to 40% of the cell's total energy. Okay? So again, a mechanism like the sodium potassium pump needs energy. Everything needs energy when it comes to cellular metabolism. And if you don't have enough ATP, this pump will slow down. And if that pump slows down, your cells then cannot stay properly hydrated. So when they're dehydrated, now, you don't have nutrients getting into the cells, and hunger signals are sent up to your brain because they are desperate for resources. So if you find yourself tired and hungry, or you think you're hungry because in fact you are tired, that is your cells telling you that you are energy starved and likely dehydrated. And so we always track hydration on the program. And the first question I ask is, how's your energy? Because the general rule of thumb is when energy is up, hydration is up. Okay. Now, what kills ATP production? Well, it's the things that we know about, but we don't always handle. So, chronic stress. I mean, we're tired of hearing about stress. We're stressed out on the subject of stress, but it's true. And what goes hand in hand with that? Well, poor sleep. Nutrient deficiencies. And especially when we are talking in regard to cellular energy and ATP, magnesium and B vitamins, sorry. Also, inflammation. And again, another one of these words we're sick of hearing. We'll talk about it later. But very important. And of course, something called damaged mitochondria. Mitochondria is like the furnaces in your cells. They're little power packets, right? And they create a lot of energy. So when we talk about hydration, which I do a lot, I mean, I feel like I am an annoying hydration wonk or something. It's kind of like if you have a psycho uncle who's always talking about the communists. Like, that's how I am about water and hydration, okay? Because hydration is not what you think it is. Everyone thinks hydration has to do with just drinking a lot of water. But cellular hydration is completely different from that, because you could drink gallons and gallons of water, still have dehydrated cells, because water needs help getting into your cells and staying in your cells, right? The cells, imagine them like grapes, and they should be plump. They should not dry out and be like raisins. So there are actually nutrients that will help water get into the cells. And it's super important. Those of you who've done the program know that we have nutrients specific for that, and it's so important. But of course, It's hard to get water into the cells if the cells are damaged, or if you are chronically inflamed, or if you don't have those nutrients. And again, I'm always harping on it, but we don't want that hydration system breaking down because it's so super important for metabolism, for everything. It's the most fundamental thing there is. So if you don't have those nutrients, then the water that you're drinking, it doesn't get into the cell, it passes right through you. Or conversely, it can get into the spaces between your cells, and you might know that as swelling, or some people have heard the term edema. All right. Now, how do you know if you have poor cellular hydration? That's something that we measure here, and it's not a direct measurement, but we do use our body composition monitor. You can get those at home as well, and those, if they're accurate, can be very, very helpful. But symptomatically, you're looking at things like constant thirst despite drinking water, dry skin even when you're drinking a lot of water, fatigue that does not improve with rest, brain fog, which I feel like everybody has these days. Who does not have brain fog? And constant hunger or cravings. Okay. Anyone has ever dealt, ask yourself if you've ever dealt with drinking tons of water, but you still feel tired and or dehydrated. Yeah, it's a common thing. Now, how do we get water into the cells? What are the nutrients that do it? Well, generally electrolytes. And the first thing everyone thinks of when they think about electrolytes is Gatorade, unfortunately. There are obviously better sources of electrolytes than that, but electrolytes is actually what moves water into the cells. So think of, we talked about sodium, we talked about potassium, we talked about magnesium. These are electrolytes, and they're kind of like the subway transport system of your cells, because water will follow these electrolytes and help them, drive the fluid into the cells to get where they need to go, where it can be useful. Okay. And again, as I said before, you want that balance of potassium and sodium. And so a lot of doctors will tell you don't eat too much sodium. Now, on our program, we give out often a very special kind of salt. And salt is important, but remember, salt is more than just sodium. The salt that we use has something like 80 vital nutrients in it. So everything in nature exists in a balance. And really, what your doctor, when he's always harping that you should not eat sodium, he doesn't want sodium without a bunch of other things. And for some people, he might not want it at all, because the sodium will pull the water out of the cells into the extracellular spaces, creating that swelling or edema that we talked about before. And that's why you need potassium. Where do you get potassium? Well, potassium you can get from green leafy vegetables, and there are other sources. Bananas, it turns out, are not a great source of potassium, interestingly enough, right? Because that's how they've marketed it. I think back in the day, someone was paid to do that by Dole, by a banana selling company. All right. I want to qualify that. I don't want to get a call from their lawyers, but I think I heard that somewhere, and I would not doubt it. Okay. But tomatoes are a much better source of potassium, for example. All right. So we don't want this system breaking down. Too much sodium from processed foods, water is going to get trapped outside the cells. You can get bloating. All right. If you have too little potassium, the cells will not hold on to the water. It will make you dehydrated. And if you don't have enough magnesium, everybody is short of magnesium, right? Magnesium deficiency is epidemic. They estimate up to 80% of people are deficient. And magnesium is required for so many things in the body, right? So if you have low magnesium, that whole pump system will fail. That's why you hear every once in a while, you'll hear about a supplement that's a supposed magic bullet. And magnesium has certainly had its day in the sun. We've all heard, take magnesium. But this is the why. I really think the why matters, because if you don't have that why, you tend not to be as motivated to do it. It's one thing that, someone says take magnesium because you need it. It's another thing to say, well, if you're not taking magnesium, then basically your cell is not going to work. In addition to that, magnesium is required for like over 300 important reactions in your body. And without it, your cellular machinery cannot function. So, for those of you who are not getting magnesium, and by the way, supplements are a great idea, and this is the why. Let's discuss inflammation. All right, we hear about that a lot as well. I usually use the metaphor when talking about inflammation of fires. I say that inflammation is like little fires in your body, and wherever they go, they cause damage. But if we're going to use our metaphor of a city, then we might want to alter that inflammation metaphor. So we might want to think about it more like the fire department. This sounds a little weird, right? Fire department is a very good thing. Firemen are heroes. But here's the thing. The fire department comes when there is a problem and they fix it generally, right? They put out fires. But in the body, we have something called chronic inflammation. And that's as if the fire department came and instead of just putting out a fire and leaving, it stayed and it continued to knock down walls and to, pour water on things at a very high pressure. It would cause damage. It would cause continuous damage. And that is what inflammation is doing in the body. It's as if the fire department did not know when to leave, right? Inflammation is in case of emergencies. That's how it's supposed to be. But chronic inflammation now will damage the cells, particularly what's called the cell membranes, the walls that protect the cells and gatekeep what goes in and what goes out. Okay, so when the cell membranes or walls are damaged, water can't get in properly, nutrients can't get in properly, waste products get trapped inside, not nice, and that little pump that we talked about cannot work. So do you see what's happening here? How everything works together. I mean, this is a geeky subject. But I feel like, and this is going to sound self-serving, I feel like you're lucky to have me to relate it to you because I am not a geek. I was more likely to put someone in a locker in high school than to be put into the locker. I speak a little bit of geek, but I'm essentially not a geek. And this is why I have to work so hard to create metaphors in order to be able to communicate, in order that this information can be used. Okay, so we want to make sure that our cell membranes are in good shape because, again, they're the gatekeepers. They protect the whole cells. All right, good fences make good neighbors. We want those good, strong fences. And here's the kicker. Inflammation will also hijack your cellular energy because instead of using that energy for positive purposes, like burning fat, for example, your cells have to use all their energy to deal with the inflammation. So that's why we hear out there in society, in the zeitgeist, we hear that we want to be anti-inflammatory. We want to eat an anti-inflammatory diet, for example. We want to address those things that cause inflammation. And what are those things? Well, processed foods and sugar. We now hear about super processed foods, right? Because there's different levels of processing. But processed foods will cause inflammation. Obviously, sugar will as well. Chronic stress, there that goes again. Okay, we can kind of like put that on a tape and keep playing it again. Same thing with poor sleep. All right, environmental toxins. Last week we talked about what's happening now with RFK Jr. and Maha. He's the head of the HHS. And, he's a controversial figure, but I said that I'm really rooting for him because he wants to address a lot of these things. Environmental toxins. The problems of chemicals in our food and this heavy toxic load that we're all subjected to. Gut imbalances. Okay, problems in the gut with what they call the flora of the gut, the little bugs that are in the gut. If we have the wrong ones, those will create chronic inflammation. So we definitely want to address that. Let's talk about hormones. When someone comes to me and they want to lose weight and we're having a discussion, I always tell them that a lot of things can slow down the metabolism. But probably the two most profound are dehydration and hormones that are out of whack. And hormones is one of those things that we hear a lot about. People will sit around and complain about their hormones or they'll take hormones. But what are they? Hormones are kind of like a cellular communication network, right? Hormones always travel. They don't stay where they're produced. They always go somewhere else to do something important, to communicate something. And when that communication network is down, everything tends to fall apart. Insulin, for example, super important when it comes to fat burning because insulin is basically trying to tell your cells to store or burn fat. But if your cells aren't working right, if they're inflamed or they're depleted of energy because they're not hydrated and they don't have enough nutrients, they can't receive those messages. And that's what your doctor might call insulin resistance. Similarly, thyroid hormones are trying to tell your cells to speed up metabolism. But your cells have to be able to respond. Otherwise, your metabolism stays sluggish. So do you see the import of having healthy cells? We tend to think, big pictures, organs and, glands like we're talking about. But the cells themselves have to be working properly in order to receive the messages, in order to create the energy. There is a hormone. It's called cortisol. We've heard about this. Many of us have heard about this. This is the stress hormone. It results from chronic stress, and it in turn creates more. And cortisol will tell your cells to hold on to fat and to break down muscle. And cortisol will especially be seen in the gut, like, the guy with the big gut. Often it's because of cortisol, and sometimes it's because of beer. I guess there's a reason we call it a beer belly and not a cortisol belly. All right. But here's what's fascinating is that if you fix cellular health, it will often fix hormone problems automatically. So, like we were saying with insulin, the cell becomes more sensitive. Instead of being insulin resistant, it becomes insulin sensitive. It's able to receive the communication again. Like a spouse that, is unable to hear their husband or wife, but suddenly one day has a realization and says, maybe I should listen. Well, that's the dream anyway. Okay, let's talk about these cellular membranes because these are the walls that protect each cell. If you don't have membranes, you don't have cells, right? They're leaking out. And so it's super important. These walls protect the cells, they also control what goes in and out. So the membranes need to be flexible and intact to work properly. You don't want stiff, brittle membranes. And they're made largely of fats. So it's very important to eat the right type of fats because you want those cell membranes to be working properly. So you do not want to eat, for example, trans fats. This is the reason why trans fats are bad for you. This is the reason why nobody uses margarine anymore. What the hell was margarine even? I think it's like plastic. Again, don't quote me. I'm not defaming anything, you know, but I don't know what the heck that stuff was or why we used it for so long, but we're not anymore for the most part. Okay. Something called oxidative stress. This is very interesting. Oxidative stress is kind of like a side effect in your body, and it's basically a process of creating rust. And oxidative stress will damage the cell walls, and you want to be able to handle your oxidative stress, and that's where antioxidants come in. When you think antioxidants, think oxidative stress. And they're able to handle that oxidative stress. That's the idea. And that's why you hear about antioxidants. They're not pro-oxidation. They're very much anti. Obviously, inflammation, as we talked about, will damage membranes, as will nutrient deficiencies, right? So you want to eat the right kind of fats, things like omega-3 fats. You've heard about them. Things like olive oil, and you can get them from salmon, and, you can get them in a lot of different ways. But it's important to do it. So when things break down in the cells, water can't get in, nutrients can't enter, waste can't leave. That important pump we talked about can't function. So it's like having a city. These days, cities don't have walls, right? But they used to. Those walls were absolutely necessary. Go to an old city in Europe or in the Middle East. I've been fortunate enough to go to Jerusalem a number of times, right? But any old city, you'll see walls. New York City, which we're using as our example, used to have walls to protect it. And that's why there's something called Wall Street. Wall Street was a wall. So these walls are vitally important. And how do we protect the walls? Well, it's from doing all those things we're talking about now. The good fats, antioxidants, adequate hydration, working on and reducing that inflammation. So I would love to hear from you, and just tell me. You could DM me. I find people are pretty shy. You could DM me if you want, and just tell me if you're seeing how everything comes together now. If this holistic perspective is more hopeful. Because we tend to look at single things in our environment, right? We reduce things. We want to know about single things, but really everything works in concert. We're talking about a symphony here. A good city works like a symphony. Okay. Lastly, let me mention something called pH balance. And this has to do with the environment of the cell. There are environmental conditions which are beneficial for the cell. There are environmental conditions which are injurious to the cell. And basically, pH has to do with acidity, and it also has to do with oxygen. And our cells function best in a very specific pH range. So, a range of acidity. If things are too acidic, then certain chemicals won't work right, and membranes will become unstable, and inflammation goes up. And of course, at this point, if I were to ask you what makes you acidic, I bet you would know, because it turns out that the bad things are the bad things. Starting out with chronic stress. And of course, a poor diet will do it. And not having the right nutrients. And that's why your mother said eat your vegetables, and she was 100% right. We talked about nutrients before, at least some of them. There are many different kind of nutrients, but those electrolytes, you can get them from vegetables. So if you're not eating vegetables, you're not eating the electrolytes. If you don't have the electrolytes, you're not going to be hydrated. If you're not hydrated, the cell doesn't function properly, and inflammation will increase, and the walls will break down, and so on and so forth. Okay? An acidic environment will make every other problem worse. It's like trying to run a city when there's toxic smog all over the place. Everything will be worse. Okay? So eat those vegetables. Make sure you're being hydrated with not only water, but you're having those good electrolytes. Again, supplements can be very beneficial. Manage that stress. Take walks in a park, in a forest. I mean, it sounds so stupid. I'm telling you to hug trees. Yes, that works. You might feel like a goofball, but if you walking through a forest path will probably do more for you than a week in a spa, or I don't know. I don't even want to say, because it'll sound like I'm downplaying certain things that people do. But it will be very beneficial for you, especially if done consistently. Okay, if you over restrict calories, by the way, for too long, then that could also lead to things like acidity, and oxidative stress. So while fasting is one of the most beneficial things you could do for health, modified fast, there are various kinds. If you do it for too long, it can lead to problems. That's why it's a good idea to manage it if you're going to do a fast or a modified fast. Okay, so this is where it gets really powerful in the interactions between these 7 factors. It's like a web. And, some people believe in nature, some people believe in God, but there seems to be, it works. This design is working for the most part. We've seen breakdowns, we've experienced breakdowns. So check this out. Imagine you're chronically stressed. Well, again, that's not going to lead to nothing, because that will lead to cortisol going up. And high cortisol creates what? Inflammation. Inflammation is going to damage those cell membranes. So now the gatekeeper is not working. Hydration won't happen. If anything, you'll become less hydrated. Poor hydration will lower that energy in the cell. We talked about, ATP. Think of energy, ATP. Low ATP is going to mean that sodium potassium pump slows down. So now that's going to affect the electrolytes. Of course, when the electrolytes balance gets disrupted, well, that's going to further affect cellular hydration. It's going to also affect pH, that environment that allows everything to function properly. And that pH will make inflammation work. And so it's this vicious cycle. And some of us have been there and have experienced it. Some of us who know better have experienced it and are experiencing it. But this is the reason why willpower alone is not the answer. And too many people are relying on willpower when the problem is largely physiological. It's largely a broken cellular machinery. Your willpower cannot overcome that. Your willpower cannot overcome a depletion of nutrients or dehydration. Willpower can help you do the right things, at least at the beginning, right? At the beginning of a journey, some willpower is necessary. But generally, what people find is that as the cell starts to be repaired, the energy goes up. Less internal force is needed, less willpower is needed. You're not as conflicted. You're not fighting that war within yourself as well. You get some good momentum going. You start to feel like a human again. You're seeing results, right? This is the power potentially of improving and fixing the cellular machinery. And that's why we're having this conversation right now. All right. Now, in case it sounds overwhelming, like, what do I do? You talked about so many things. Be aware of this. Just as one problem will affect other things, we talked about 7 different factors, and having a problem with one of them can affect all the rest. It's also true that when you support one area, everything else can start improving. So it's a good idea to choose one thing. Whatever that thing is, right? Fix your sleep. Don't stay up on screens. Get to sleep at a reasonable hour. Work on inflammation. How do you decrease inflammation? Well, certain supplements, like I said, will help an awful lot. Eliminating toxic foods will help. Increasing your vegetables, right? Choose one thing that you know you can do, that you know you can control, that will not overwhelm you. And when you do that, then you can start to see a difference. And it's not nearly as difficult as improving everything at once. That can be done too. That often is done. But if all you can fix is one thing, then you're doing something. And after you have that down, then maybe you could think about fixing something else. All right. So that's really what I want you to do. I have a bunch of action steps written out, but I'm not going to read it because I'm stopping right there, because that is the best thing to do, is to choose the one thing you know you can do, you know you're going to do. So this has been a really cool discussion, I think. We geeked out a little bit, but not too much. And I hope you're seeing that health and weight loss is not necessarily about deprivation. It's not about punishment. That's what people tell you if they're trying to sell you product. It's about giving your body what it needs. And again, the most fundamental unit in your body is your cells. And when they're functioning right, then you have a chance to be healthy and energetic and to lose fat. All right. You remember, your bodies want to be healthy. Your cells want to be efficient, but they need the right environment. They need the right nutrients and the right support. All right. That's going to be it for this week. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for joining me, and I will be here next week. We'll do it again. Take care.